Chapter 14 of Christianity in the Apostolic Age. Christianity in the Apostolic Age by George Purves. 3. The Council at Jerusalem. 147. The composure of the Church was at last disturbed by the inevitable controversy concerning the obligation of Gentile believers to observe the Mosaic law. The controversy was inevitable because the principle of salvation by faith alone, which had been proclaimed from the beginning, and on which the expansion among the Gentiles had proceeded, was really inconsistent with the binding obligation on Gentiles of the law. In spite of the harmony which had existed, the question was certain to be raised. On its solution, in fact, the continued unity and progress of the cause depended. 3 positions were possible. It might be held that all believers were freed from the law. This could be maintained only so far as it was realized that the work of Messiah had satisfied the requirements of the law and thus relieved his people from them. Or it might be held that Jews alone were bound to observe the law. This could be maintained on the ground that Mosaism was a national religion and therefore binding on Christian Hebrews as Hebrews, though not as Christians. Or finally, it might be held that the law was still binding upon all, and that Gentiles must accept it in order to be Christians. This view would make Christianity merely a purified Judaism, and would be really inconsistent with the doctrine of salvation by faith in Jesus, which had been taught from the beginning. It is clear that these opinions were certain to appear among the Christian Jews. It is equally clear that the question at issue would prove a burning one, for all the prejudices and traditions of Judaism were involved in it. But the third view meant a death blow to the expanding faith and to its integrity and sufficiency. The decision, therefore, was as necessary as the controversy was inevitable. 148. The controversy actually broke out in Antioch after the return of Barnabas and Paul from their successful missionary journey. The rapid spread of Gentile Christianity aroused the anxiety and displeasure of some of the stricter Jewish party in Jerusalem. It seemed to them to threaten seriously the reverence for the Mosaic law, which they held to be due from all followers of Messiah. It even appeared possible that Christianity might be wholly separated from Judaism and the preeminence of Israel be lost. The anomalous condition which had heretofore existed could therefore no longer be allowed. Steps must be taken to prevent the destruction of Jewish prerogative and custom. And since adherence to a considerable extent had been made by the Church from the Pharisees, we can well believe that the influence of this strict Jewish party had become greater in the Jerusalem congregation than it had been at an earlier period. Hence, certain of them went to Antioch and boldly taught that unless believers were circumcised, they could not be saved. Acts chapter 15, verse 1. Later events prove that these emissaries did not represent the majority of the Mother Church, still less her leaders. They represented only the Pharisaic party. Acts chapter 15, verse 5. There is evidence also that the visit was prompted by a factious spirit. The disclaimer afterwards made by, quote, the apostles and elders, end quote, chapter 15, verse 24, seems to imply that these missionaries of Judaism had falsely declared to the Antiochians that the leaders in Jerusalem shared their views or had even sent them on their mission. Their teaching was in fact revolutionary, and they must have known it to be so. Paul, speaking of the same class of teachers, if not of these very men, calls them, quote, false brethren, privily brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage, end quote. Galatians chapter 2, verse 4, Revised Version. The Judaizers might seem merely to be anxious to preserve the loyalty to the law which Jewish Christians had always professed, but in reality they were disloyal to the principle of faith, which was distinctive of the gospel, and to the fraternal liberality toward Gentile brethren, which the Church had long displayed. They were the means, however, of bringing this fundamental question to a definite issue. 149. In consequence of the Judaistic agitation, the Church of Antioch sent a deputation, at the head of which were Paul and Barnabas, to lay the matter before the apostles and elders in Jerusalem. Acts chapter 15, verse 2. This is the visit described by Paul in Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. In both accounts, the acting parties and the purpose of the visit are the same. We have already seen, note, in section 116, end note, that Galatians chapter 2 does not refer to the visit with the gifts from Antioch, and it cannot refer to a visit later than this one, because Paul's argument absolutely requires that he should not pass this visit over in silence. Footnote: the recent conjecture of J.V. Bartlett, Apostolic Age, page 57, that Galatians chapter 2 verses 1 to 10 describes an unrecorded visit of Paul to Jerusalem earlier than that of Acts chapter 9 verse 30, does not seem to have any tangible evidence to support it. It assumes also a doubtful interpretation of 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 2 to 5. Moreover, the visit of Galatians was certainly a public and representative one, so that its omission by Paul is inexplicable. End footnote. At the same time, the two accounts of the visit by Luke and Paul are written from different points of view. Luke traces historically the external events to their issue. Paul wrote for the specific purpose of showing that his own apostolic authority and teaching had been recognized by the Mother Church and her leaders. He therefore only alludes to such facts as were of importance for his argument. The two accounts are thus supplementary. Their harmony has frequently been denied, but is now generally admitted in all essential points, and a close examination fails to show any points in which they are discordant. 150. Thus, according to Acts, the visit was that of a deputation sent by the Antiochian Church. Paul, on the other hand, relates that he went up, quote, by revelation, end quote. Galatians chapter 2, verse 2. Yet it is easy to understand that, in so grave a crisis, and especially when, by going, he seemed to submit his preaching to the judgment of others, he needed a revelation to make his duty clear. Again, he mentions, while Acts does not, the presence of Titus, and makes much of the fact that the latter was not compelled to be circumcised. He does this because Titus, who was doubtless one of the Antiochian delegation, was a test case for his argument, since the reception of Titus as a Christian brother proved, in the most practical way, the Church's recognition of Paul's ministry and teaching. So too, the spirit in which Paul and Barnabas made the visit corresponds in both accounts. According to Acts, in chapter 15, verse 3, they proclaimed as they went the conversion of the Gentiles. In Galatians, Paul relates, quote, I laid before them, note, that is, the Christians in Jerusalem, end note, the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately before them who were of repute, note, an additional fact, end note, lest by any means I should be running, or had run, in vain, end quote. Galatians chapter 2, verse 2, Revised Version. The last clause does not mean that he submitted his teaching to the judgment of others, being willing to retract it if they disapproved, for he immediately adds that when false brethren demanded the circumcision of Titus, he would not yield even for an hour. The clause in question describes rather a confident appeal to the brethren to say if it were true, as some alleged, that he was running in vain. Compare Meyer-Sieffert, Kommentar. In both accounts, therefore, the deputation went to Jerusalem, recognizing indeed the ecclesiastical authority of the Mother Church, but confident of her support and prepared to maintain their views to the end. 151. According to both accounts, also, the general sentiment of the Church was disturbed in Jerusalem, as it had been in Antioch, by the Judaizers, who violently maintained that Gentile converts should be required to observe the Mosaic law. Acts chapter 15, verses 3 to 5. Galatians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. In Acts, it is related that this led to the convening of a council, composed of the apostles and elders, at which the subject was discussed, addresses made by Peter, Paul, Barnabas, and James, and the decision reached that Gentiles should not be required to observe the law, but only to abstain from certain acts peculiarly offensive to Jews. Chapter 15, verses 6 to 29. Paul does not mention the council, yet his declaration that Titus was not compelled to be circumcised, and that this was a refusal by the Jerusalem church to accede to the demands of the false brethren, Galatians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, implies that formal action of some kind was taken. He pithily states, by presenting the concrete case of Titus, the main result of the council which Luke describes. Again, in Acts, chapter 15, verses 6 and 22, the council is said to have been composed of, the apostles and elders, while Peter and James delivered the chief addresses. Paul speaks of having seen of the apostles only Peter and John, but the presence of these two is sufficient to justify Luke's expressions, even if no other apostles were there, while according to both sources, James appears as the most influential personage. Acts chapter 15, verses 13 to 21, Galatians chapter 2, verse 7. It might seem, from Acts chapter 15, verse 22, that the whole church was present at the deliberation, but the language probably means merely that the decision met with its approval. It is, however, worthy of note that Paul also, Galatians chapter 2, verses 2 to 5, represents the church as a whole as supporting his position. 152. Paul, however, adds one fact of which Acts says nothing, namely that he had also private conferences with James, Peter, and John. He calls them by the indefinite but honourable title, those of repute, Galatians chapter 2, verses 2 and 6. The pillars of the church, chapter 2, verse 9, using terms which applied to them all, whatever their office. And while he stoutly asserts, as his argument made needful, that they added nothing to his apostolic authority or teaching, records that they gave to him and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, and agreed that, in accordance with God's manifest will, he and Barnabas should go to the Gentiles, while they laboured among the Jews. His was the gospel of the uncircumcision, while Peter's was that of the circumcision. Chapter 2, verse 7. These phrases do not describe different gospels, but the two spheres in which the same gospel was to be carried. Paul's description of the conference is a notable addition to Luke's narrative, yet it was most natural that they should have been held. We can hardly conceive of their not being held between such men. The failure of Luke to mention them was obviously due to the fact that they were not part of the public history of the transaction which he was narrating. Paul mentions them only because it was afterwards charged in Galatia that the leaders of the mother church were opposed to him. In like manner, the request of James, Peter, and John that he should remember the poor, Galatians chapter 2, verse 10, was evidently occasioned by his previous visit with the gifts from Antioch, and by their fear lest, with a division of fields of labour, the needy Judeans might suffer. It is not mentioned by Luke because it was purely a personal request. 153. Moreover, the fact that for the decision of this question a council was held throws incidental light on the organization of the church. As already stated, in section 103, the apostles had before this time devolved the ordinary government of the churches on the local eldership. Those of the apostles who were present sat indeed in the council in virtue of their apostolic office, and are mentioned as a first and separate class in the letter which the council prepared, chapter 15, verse 23. But they did not decide the matter at issue on apostolic authority, for while doctrine was involved, the question was in form ecclesiastical. Should the Gentile converts be required to observe the law, chapter 15, verse 5, as the condition of fellowship? Men might agree on the same answer for different reasons, or might differ in the answer, though agreeing on the main point. Moreover, even in the earliest period, the apostles had called out the action of the brethren in determining the organization of the church. Acts chapter 1 verses 16 and 23, and chapter 6 verses 3 to 6. Much more, now that the organization was complete, would the authority of the elders be recognized. The mode of procedure followed is therefore not inconsistent with the authority of the apostles, which we have found existing from the beginning. It is to be observed also that the Jerusalem church, acting through the council, appears to have been regarded as the supreme court of the Christians in Palestine and Syria. Hence the appeal to it by the brethren in Antioch and by the Judaizers. Hence too the authoritative language of the letter which the council wrote, chapter 15 verse 28. The most natural explanation of this is that the eldership of Jerusalem was considered by the Judaic Christians and by the mixed churches of Syria, which had originated from Jewish missions, in much the same light in which the Sanhedrin of Jerusalem was by the Jews. This was only the further carrying over into the Christian churches of the synagogal system, of which the Sanhedrin was the head. We shall find hereafter that in the purely Gentile churches afterwards founded by Paul, the ecclesiastical authority of the Jerusalem eldership was not recognized. Wholly independent churches, bound only by the common faith, sprang up. But for the time of which we are treating, and for the parties engaged in the discussion, the eldership of Jerusalem constituted the recognized head of the Christian synagogues. 154. The addresses made in the council are also worthy of special notice. Peter, chapter 15, verses 7 to 11, strongly maintained the liberty of the Gentiles, appealing to the testimony of God in the case of Cornelius. Faith, he said, was the only condition of being purified. Compare chapter 10, verse 15. He went so far as to speak of the law as an unbearable yoke on the Jews themselves, since they could not really keep it, and reminded the assembly that they too depended for salvation solely on the grace of Christ. This address puts Peter thoroughly on Pauline ground. The trustfulness of the report is amply confirmed by Paul's subsequent rebuke of Peter in Antioch, where he faltered in the application of his acknowledged principles. Galatians chapter 2 verses 15 and 16, as well as by Peter's later writings. Paul and Barnabas took part in the proceedings merely by relating what God had done in attestation of the work among the Gentiles. Acts chapter 15 verse 12. Compare Galatians chapter 2 verses 2 and 7. It was James, the Lord's brother, who made the decisive address. Chapter 15 verses 13 to 21. He was cautious and anxious to secure harmony, yet he admitted that the Lord's revelation to Peter practically settled the matter. He spoke, however, of the Gentile converts as an addition to Israel, such as Amos, chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, had predicted. He thus recognized the special privileges of the Jews, yet to them Gentiles were to be added, and they should accept it as God's will. Hence he judged that no further burden should be laid upon the Gentiles than that they should abstain from certain pollutions, namely, the food offered to idols, fornication, things strangled, and blood. These conditions of fellowship he insisted on, because they would do much to prevent offense being given to the Jews by the uncircumcised converts. 155. James's address, therefore, unlike Peter's, was conservative and prudential. Both singularly correspond with the characters of the two men. They show differences of temperament and of points of view, while agreeing on the main issue. James's address and the letter drawn up at his suggestion have also some striking verbal resemblances to the language of his epistle. Compare chapter 15 verse 23 with James chapter 1 verse 1. Chapter 15 verse 17 with James chapter 2 verse 7, chapter 15 verse 13 with James chapter 2 verse 5, chapter 15 verse 14 with James chapter 1 verse 27, chapter 15, verse 19, with James chapter 5, verses 19 and 20, chapter 15, verse 29, with James chapter 1, verse 27. Both address and epistle show his thoroughly Jewish as well as Christian character, and the writer of the epistle, who makes faith the essence of true religion, urges on Jewish disciples a spiritual interpretation of the law, warns them against faults peculiar to them as Jews, and writes not a word concerning their national hopes, was quite the man to take the position which is narrated of him in the council. He cannot, therefore, any more than Peter, be classed with the Judaizers. 156. The result of the deliberations was that a letter, addressed in the name of the apostles and elders to the Gentile believers in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia, was sent by the hands of Silas and Judas Barsabbas, two of the leading men of the Jerusalem church, chapter 15, verses 22 to 29. In it, the council repudiated the Judaizers, spoke in cordial terms of Barnabas and Paul, and briefly declared that it was the mind of the Spirit and of themselves to lay nothing further on the Gentiles than the 4 acts of abstinence which James has suggested, and which they considered necessary. This was certainly not a compromise with the Judaizers. The freedom of Gentiles from the law was fully conceded. At the same time, the council protected the feelings of the Jews against what the latter regarded as abominations of the Gentiles. The decree laid down no doctrine. It confined itself to terms of fellowship. It established a modus vivendi. In granting freedom from the law, the council felt that it acted in accordance with the evident will of the Spirit, but it seemed to it absolutely necessary that this freedom should in no way appear to Jewish eyes to sully the Christian name by the introduction of offensive pagan customs. 157. The requirement of these 4 special forms of abstinence raises, however, several difficulties. For instance, it appears strange that fornication should be classed with things ethically indifferent. Just this strangeness, however, is an assurance that the report is authentic, and the difficulty is removed when it is observed that the acts of abstinence were demanded solely in order not to offend Jews. The intrinsic quality of the acts themselves did not come into consideration. Now, fornication was regarded by the Jews, as well it might be, compare Lecky, History of European Morals, chapter 5, as a typical pagan custom. It was often sanctified by pagan religions, and nowhere more so than in Western Asia. It was too often regarded with indifference in Greco-Roman society. It therefore would naturally be mentioned by a Jew as a threatened Gentile abomination. Another difficulty is raised by the apparent identity of abstinence from things strangled and from blood. Efforts to remove this obscurity by altering the text of the Acts may be traced as far back as the 2nd century. Perhaps the best explanation is that the second of these 2 prohibitions was intended to state the general principle, of which eating things strangled was the commonest example, and so both to cover other instances and to state fully the principle itself. 158. But it is more important to notice the motive of the decree as a whole. It has often been maintained that it exacted of Gentile converts the same requirements made by Jews on strangers, or as they were afterwards called, proselytes of the gate, who observed the so-called precepts of Noah, but were not recognized as belonging to Israel. It is quite doubtful, however, if at the time of the council there was any code of requirements for such adherents of Judaism, or if there was any such class of proselytes recognized at all. Schurer, History of the Jewish People, Volume 2, 317. Outside of proselytes proper, the Gentile followers of Judaism varied greatly in the degree in which they adopted Jewish customs. Moreover, the so-called Noachic precepts mentioned by later writers were 7 in number. Compare Hort, Judaistic Christianity, page 69. It is a more plausible supposition that the acts of abstinence were suggested by the prohibitions for the stranger, which are found in Leviticus chapters 17 and 18. Yet even these do not coincide precisely with those of the decree, though they may well have been at the basis of the Jewish abhorrence of the acts which the decree forbade. Any view which assumes that the Gentile converts were not recognized by the council as full members of the church is inconsistent with the whole tenor of the decree and with Paul's acceptance of its provisions. Its motive was to prevent offense to the Jews who dwelt in every city, and the simplest explanation is that these four things were prohibited because they were the Gentile customs which were most abhorrent in Jewish eyes. 159. Yet even so, can we believe that the decree with these prohibitions was accepted by Paul, and that, as Acts chapter 16 verse 4 records, he delivered it to the churches previously founded by him and Barnabas? As already observed, he does not mention it in his Galatian epistle. Moreover, in Romans chapter 14 verses 13 to 23 and 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 10 verses 23 to 33, where he discusses the use of food offered to idols, he does not refer to the decision of the council, but argues the subject independently and boldly asserts that the use of such food is in itself a matter of indifference. Fornication, likewise, he treats as inherently and always wrong. For example, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18. These facts have seemed to some to prove that he could not have accepted or even known of the decree. The inference has also been drawn that the decree was either never issued or was issued at a later time and erroneously attributed by Luke to the council. But this is to do injustice to so accurate a historian as Luke, and the apparent difficulties are capable of satisfactory explanation. For in regard to Paul's acceptance of the decree, it should be remembered that he had gained his main point and would not be likely to refuse to do his part towards securing harmony. That would be quite contrary to all that we know of his disposition. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 19 to 23. It should further be noted that the churches to which he delivered the decree, Acts chapter 16 verse 4, were founded by him and Barnabas on their mission from Antioch. They were doubtless regarded as an extension of the work in Antioch, and so shared in the recognition of the authority of the mother church. Within the sphere, therefore, which the church then covered, the authority of the council would be admitted, and since the freedom of Gentile converts had been acknowledged, there was nothing in Paul's character or doctrine which makes it improbable that he accepted, for those whom he represented, the conditions imposed. 160. The churches, however, founded by Paul after the council in his missionary work, stood in a different relation to the Church of Jerusalem. It is possible that the activity of the Judaizers in Antioch convinced him that it was better to have his churches independent. It is possible that the agreement with James, Peter, and John at the time of the council that he and Barnabas should go to the Gentiles was understood to place his new churches on an independent basis. At any rate, their independence is evident. He treats them in his epistles not only as his own spiritual offspring, but as separate societies who owned the superiority of no other church. All were indeed united in one great spiritual body in Christ, and he stimulated one by the example of others. He especially kept them mindful of their confraternity with 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 14, Ephesians chapter 2 verses 11 to 22, and their indebtedness to Romans chapter 15 verses 26 and 27, the churches of Judea. But there is not a hint that the authority of the Jerusalem eldership was recognized by them. In fact, as we shall find, this was a point on which he resisted the intrusions of the Judaizers into his territory. Galatians chapter 2 verse 6, 2 Corinthians chapter 3 verse 1. Hence it is not surprising that he does not refer to the decree, but instructs his converts independently. The epistle to the Galatians is the one in which such a reference would be most expected, since he there describes his visit to Jerusalem at the time of the council. But since he alludes to the council only indirectly and confines himself to the single point of the recognition by the Church of his authority and teaching, it is hardly surprising that he omits also all reference to the decree. The Judaizers themselves had violated the compact by denying the freedom from the law which the council had granted, and the whole discussion had reverted to the original question of circumcision. It is, however, still more important to observe that, in his instructions about food offered to idols, Paul acted precisely on the principle on which the prohibitions of the decree were based, namely that offence should not be given. The situation in Corinth was very different from that in Antioch. There, the difficulty in the use of food offered to idols lay in the danger of participating in heathen festivals and of wounding the conscience of the newly converted Gentile brother. Paul maintains the entire moral indifference of the act of eating such food, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 4 to 6, but he warmly urges the principle that abstinence for the sake of others is often the dictate of Christian love. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 7 to 13, Romans chapter 14, verse 21. He seems even to broaden intentionally the principle of the council when he wrote, quote, "Give no occasion of stumbling either to Jews or to Greeks, or to the church of God." End quote. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 32. It is thus clear that, on his declared principles, we should expect to find him accepting the decree for those under the authority of the council, while the instructions to his own separate churches show how sincere was his harmony of spirit with the apostles and elders at Jerusalem. 161. Thus Judaic Christianity performed its greatest service by acknowledging at this critical juncture the freedom of Gentile converts from the Mosaic law. It was the triumph of loyalty to the manifest will of God, achieved in the face of enormous prejudice. The Judaizing minority had in their favour all the instincts and traditions of their race. It would seem that the action of the council can only be explained by the previous occurrence of such facts indicative of the will of God as the Acts relates. Even the teaching of Jesus, though it plainly foretold the conversion of the Gentiles, and even the rejection of the Jews, for example, Matthew chapter 8, verses 10 and 11, and though its spirit was wholly opposed to Jewish exclusiveness, required further revelations of the will of God to cause it to be interpreted as relieving believers from the observance of the law. The Mother Church recognized the manifest will of God, and by following it, made room, at the cost of its own preeminence, for the full development of the faith. For her decision involved the fundamental principle that faith alone was the condition of salvation. The law might still be obligatory on Jews, but it could not be the means of salvation. This was fully realized by Paul, and explains why he would not yield a moment to the Judaizers. Yet how intense the feeling of the Jewish Christians was, through what a conflict the result was reached, and what variety of opinion still existed concerning the authority of the law, appears from an incident which occurred at Antioch not long after the adjournment of the council. 162. For when the deputation returned to Antioch with the commissioners and the letter of the council, they were received with joy. Silas and Judas heartily explained the council's action, and after a brief sojourn returned to Jerusalem. For a while peace seemed to be assured, and this appeared the more probable when Peter himself visited Antioch and freely ate with the Gentile brethren, doubtless at their love feasts, on terms of perfect equality. Galatians chapter 2, verse 12. We must certainly place this incident here, because Paul plainly assigns it to the period following the council, and yet mentions Barnabas as present, though the latter left Antioch shortly before Paul's second journey. Acts chapter 15, verse 39. We may well believe that Peter's generous nature rejoiced in the conversion of the Gentiles, and was anxious to prove by acts the sincerity of the position he had taken at the council. The disregard of Jewish scruples had long prevailed in Antioch, and Paul and Barnabas had not only defended the liberty of the Gentiles, but considered themselves free to observe the ritual law or not, as they might deem best. Compare 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 20 and 21. This attitude Peter also was now willing to take. 163. The peace of the church in Antioch was, however, again disturbed. Certain men came there who had been sent from Jerusalem by James. Galatians chapter 2, verse 12. There is no hint that they had been sent to play the spy on the Jews in Antioch, still less that they were Judaizers, nor that they bore any missive from James. It is probable that they had been sent by him on an evangelizing mission among the Jews of Syria. But their presence led Peter and even Barnabas, as well as the other Jewish Christians, to withdraw their fellowship with the Gentiles. This shows the intense feeling on the part of the main body of the Jewish church against the violation by any Jew of the ceremonial law. The council had accepted the Gentile converts as brethren, but had never intimated that the law was not binding on Jews. And though a minority might feel relieved from it, the convictions of the vast majority were the other way. Possibly, too, the action of the council made the Jewish Christians more earnest in their own loyalty to the law, and it would seem a fair inference that James, though fully in sympathy with Gentile freedom, supported the popular sentiment that Jews ought to be faithful to their national customs. It is not hard to understand this. The Jewish Christians were anxious not to appear to their fellow countrymen disloyal to Moses. They themselves shared the national and traditional spirit. The new faith must be shown to be harmonious with the older revelation, and few could believe this if the sacred laws were cast aside by Jews themselves. So the sentiment was overpowering that Jewish Christians should be faithful to the Mosaic law. Peter and even Barnabas may easily have thought, in view of this state of feeling, that they would destroy their influence among their countrymen if their free intercourse with Gentiles were known. It was at least quite in accord with Peter's impulsive character that, as he had broken with bonds of Judaism through his sympathy with the Gentiles, he should hasten to fasten them again upon himself through fear of offending his Jewish brethren. 164. But he found in Paul a remorseless logician and a fearless champion of faith. Paul's conduct had been generally condemned in Antioch, Galatians chapter 2, verse 11, Revised Version, and a scandal was threatened by it. If he had never consorted with Gentiles, no fault would have been found with him, but by doing so, he had publicly declared that faith alone was the condition of salvation, and now by withdrawing, he virtually declared that he had been wrong. He seemed to imply practically that all Gentiles as well as Jews ought to observe the law. For this, Paul took him publicly to task. He gives a summary of his rebuke in Galatians chapter 2, verses 14 to 21. Why, he asked, do you thus compel Gentiles to Judaize? He reminded Peter that they both, though Jews, had sought justification through faith alone in Christ, and on the ground explicitly that by the works of the law none could be justified. Could they have been wrong in this? Did Christ lead them into sin? Nay, a man who builds what he has destroyed shows himself to be the transgressor. Then Paul stated the doctrine of salvation as he knew it, and as Peter must confess it. The law had made Christ's death necessary, but by that death it had been wholly satisfied. In that death Paul himself had died, so that the demands of the law had been met by him in Christ. He now lived as reconciled to God, the power of Christ working in him to do God's will, and he living by faith in the Son of God who had died for him. Hence, to regard observance of law as necessary for the salvation of any believer, whether Jew or Gentile, was to imply that Christ had died in vain. 165. This address not only discloses Paul's theological position, compare sections 84 to 89, but throws light from the inside on the whole controversy about circumcision. The doctrinal principle involved in the ecclesiastical question before the council is now made plain. The significance of the death of Christ lay in its satisfaction of the divine law for the sinner. And just so far as this was realized, was the law seen to have fulfilled its purpose as a religious system. Its moral principles were to be now embodied in life by the believer, not in order to be saved by obedience to them, but out of love for God, to whom he had already been reconciled by Christ's obedience to and satisfaction of the law. Its ceremonial acts need not be performed at all, or only as other considerations might make advisable, for they were but the shadow of the reality, namely Christ. In proportion as this was realized, the death blow was given to Judaism. Christianity could not be permanently Judaic. It could never be Judaistic. Jewish Christians might still observe their law, but only as Jews, not as Christians. The principle of faith thus wrought out its logical consequences in the history, while through the realization of the nature of Messiah's death, the sufficiency of faith was rationally grounded. A crucified Messiah and salvation by faith were found to be necessarily conjoined. The outward movement of events, whereby faith had been proved to be the only condition of salvation which God required, united with the growing perception of the meaning of the cross to create universal Christianity. The issue was thus the result of the working out of the fundamental truths of the gospel by the combined operation of both history and logic. Though further conflict was to follow, the result could no longer be doubtful. 166. We know nothing of the immediate effect of Paul's rebuke on his fellow apostle. The most natural inference is that Peter acknowledged his error. It was not an error of teaching, but of conduct, and he was quite the man to confess his faults. This inference is confirmed by the thoroughly Pauline character of his teaching in his epistles. Certainly, there is no reason to suppose that the rebuke caused dissension between the apostles, or that it was the cause of the suspicion with which Paul was regarded for a long time by many Jewish Christians. Acts chapter 21, verse 21. Neither is it surprising that Luke does not mention the incident, as there is no reason to regard it as in itself more than a local and unimportant event. Apart from the light thrown by it on the theological position of the two apostles, its chief interest lies in the fact that it completes our view of the condition of Judaic Christianity at the time of the council. The great principle of Gentile freedom was conceded, though by the concession, Judaic Christianity, as both Paul and the Judaizers perceived, was doomed to be only one phase of the new religion, and ultimately to perish in giving birth to a universal faith. End of chapter 14.